The tropical dawn of December 7th, 1941, did not arrive with a bang, but with a deceptive, haunting stillness. The air over Oahu was thick with the scent of hibiscus and damp earth, a sweetness that masked the salt spray of the Pacific. On the deck of the USS Arizona, Seaman Second Class Elias Thorne leaned against the cold railing, watching the sky turn from a bruised purple to a pale, hopeful gold. To Elias, a kid from the dust-choked plains of Kansas, this harbor was more than a naval base. It was a sanctuary of steel. The massive battleships sat like sleeping prehistoric beasts in the water. The Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the Maryland moored in a neat, proud line that signaled American invincibility. There was no radar pinging a warning in his mind, no gut feeling of dread. There was only the clink of mess kits from the galley and the distant sound of a bugle practicing for morning colors. He was thinking of home, of the girl who promised to wait, and of the sheer, impossible blue of the Hawaiian water. He didn't know that in less than 60 minutes, that water would be choked with oil and burning with a fire that no ocean could put out. Miles away, hidden by the low-hanging clouds, the first wave of the Imperial Japanese Navy's strike force was descending like a swarm of angry hornets. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looked out from his cockpit, his eyes fixed on the long bridge of Oahu. To him, the island wasn't a paradise, it was a target map. The strategy was surgical, born of months of secret rehearsals in the misty bays of Kyushu. As the Zero fighters broke through the cloud cover, the shimmering expanse of Pearl Harbor laid itself out before them, vulnerable and glistening. Fuchida felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He keyed his radio, the two words that would ignite a global conflagration, crackling through the headsets of hundreds of pilots. Tora, Tora, Tora. The surprise was complete. The giant was not only sleeping, it was dreaming of peace. The first explosion hit the hangar at Wheeler Field, a deafening crump that rattled the teeth of every man on the island. At Pearl Harbor, the initial reaction wasn't fear, but confusion. A senior officer on the USS Nevada looked up, seeing the red sun insignia on the wings of a low-flying plane, and famously remarked that it was the best-looking drill the Army Air Corps had ever.
As the sun reached its zenith, the smoke over Oahu was so thick it blotted out the light. The day of infamy had left 2,403 Americans dead and a nation in a state of catatonic shock. But beneath the grief, a terrifying new energy was coiling. In Washington, D.C., the phone lines were screaming. In small towns across the Midwest, young men were walking out of movie theaters and straight into recruitment offices. The Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had allegedly feared that they had done nothing but awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He was right. The attack on Pearl Harbor was intended to break the American spirit, to force a surrender before the fight even began. Instead, it welded the American people into a singular, unstoppable machine of industry and vengeance. The fire that started in the hulls of the battleships would eventually travel across the globe, fueled by the memory of the men who never made it out of the Arizona. The world had changed in 2 hours, and the path to victory would be paved with the echoes of that Sunday morning. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m., a jagged formation of 81 dive bombers and 36 fighters that looked like a plague of locusts against the tropical sky. If the first wave had been a surgical strike, the second was a brutal hammer blow designed to finish what the first had started. On the ground at Honolulu, the civilian population was just waking up to a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. Mrs. Alice Miller, hanging laundry in her backyard 3 miles from the harbor, watched a stray anti-aircraft shell whistle through her neighbor's roof, the explosion sending a cloud of shingles and dust into her pristine garden.
The radio was a frantic mess of static and screaming announcers. "This is the real McCoy," the voice crackled over KGU, but the words felt hollow against the sight of the massive black mushroom cloud rising over the naval base, a pillar of smoke so thick it looked like a solid mountain of soot. At the harbor's edge, the water was no longer the postcard blue that had drawn thousands to the islands. It was a viscous, bubbling black sludge of heavy fuel oil, slick and treacherous. For the men of the USS Oklahoma, the world had literally turned upside down. The ship had capsized under the weight of 9 torpedo hits, its massive hull rolling over like a dying whale, trapping hundreds of sailors in the darkness of the inverted lower decks. Inside, the silence was more terrifying than the explosions. Men stood on what used to be the ceiling, water slowly rising to their chests, the only sound the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of wrenches against the hull, a desperate metallic heartbeat signaling to the rescue crews outside that life still flickered in the dark. Elias Thorne, miraculously thrown clear of the Arizona's main blast, found himself on a small motor launch, his hands raw and bleeding from pulling oil-slicked survivors from the burning water. The men he pulled in didn't look like sailors anymore. They looked like statues carved from charcoal, their eyes wide with a shock that transcended physical pain. Every time a Japanese Zero roared low over the water to strafe for rescue boats, Elias felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury. He watched the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway, limp toward the channel. She was a magnificent, tragic sight, her American flag snapping in the wind of her own movement, while bombs rained down on her deck. The Japanese pilots, seeing a chance to sink a battleship in the narrow channel and block the entire harbor, swarmed her. But the Nevada refused to be a cork in the bottle. Her captain grounded her at Hospital Point, her guns still barking until the very end. By 10 a.m., the sky finally began to clear of the attackers, leaving behind a silence that was far more haunting than the roar of the engines. The greatest generation was being born in the blood-slicked corridors of the Naval Hospital, where nurses worked until their white uniforms were stained entirely crimson. There was no morphine left, only the smell of burnt flesh and the quiet prayers of chaplains moving among the rows of stretchers. In the city of Honolulu, the fear was palpable. Rumors of a Japanese paratrooper invasion spread like wildfire. Local men grabbed hunting rifles and pitchforks, standing guard over their porches, eyes glued to the horizon. They didn't know yet that the Japanese fleet was already turning back toward the North Pacific, leaving behind a graveyard. Back at the docks, the scale of the infamy was becoming clear. The Arizona was still groaning, a submerged tomb for 1,177 men. The California was settling into the mud, and the West Virginia was a burnt-out shell. But amid the wreckage, something was stirring. It wasn't just the smoke rising, it was the American resolve. Men who had been enemies in the barracks an hour ago were now... The heart of the country began to beat with a mechanical, rhythmic fury. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up to scream, it woke up to build. In Detroit, car assembly lines were ripped apart and reborn as tank factories overnight. In the shipyards of California and Virginia, the skeletons of new carriers rose from the docks with a speed that defied the laws of traditional industry. The grief for the Arizona was being transmuted into a singular national obsession, retribution. This resolve found its face in Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. By early 1942, the American spirit needed more than just speeches. It needed a sign that the enemy was not untouchable. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Launch heavy B-25 Army bombers from the short deck of a Navy aircraft carrier, something never before attempted, and fly them directly over the heart of Tokyo. On the deck of the USS Hornet, the air was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel and the spray of a restless sea. The pilots knew this was a one-way trip. They didn't have enough fuel to return to the ship. They would have to bomb their targets and pray they could reach the coast of China before their engines sputtered and died in the dark. As Doolittle's plane revved its engines, the nose hanging precariously over the churning white foam of the Pacific, the sailors on deck cheered with a feral intensity. When the wheels finally lifted, clear